That the war on drugs had relatively little to do with genuine concern about drug addiction or the harms of drug abuse, and much to do with politics, racial politics. Numerous historians and political scientists have now documented that the war on drugs was part of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who are anxious about, resentful of, fearful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. Now, I think to be fair, we have to acknowledge that poor and working class whites really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. You know, wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools, give their kids all of the advantages that wealth has to offer. But poor and working class whites, many of whom were themselves struggling for survival, many of whom in the South were themselves illiterate, they faced a social demotion. It was their kids that might get bused across town to go to a school that they believed was inferior. It was their kids and themselves who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for limited jobs with this whole new group of people they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And then, to make matters worse from their perspective, affirmative action programs created the perception that black folks were now leapfrogging over them. And this state of affairs created an enormous amount of fear, anger, resentment, anxiety, but it also created an enormous political opportunity. Pollsters and political strategists found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them, a group not so subtly defined by race, could be enormously successful in persuading poor and working class whites to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. It was part of the effort to flip the South from blue to red with coded racial rhetoric on getting tough on crime and welfare. And a couple years after the drug war was announced, crack began to ravage inner city communities. And the Reagan administration seized on this development, actually hiring staff whose job it was to publicize inner city crack babies, crack dealers, the so-called crack whores, and crack-related violence. And as drug crime and blackness became conflated in the media, a wave of punitiveness swept over the United States. Legislators started passing harsh mandatory minimum sentences for minor drug crime, sentences harsher than murderers receive in many other Western democracies. And soon, Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher. And it was the Clinton administration that championed the laws banning drug offenders from federal financial aid for schooling upon release, banning drug offenders and people with criminal records from public housing, denying food stamps. To a large extent, so many of the rules, laws, policies, and practices that constitute the basic architecture of this new caste system were championed by a Democratic administration, desperate to win back those so-called white swing voters, folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the civil rights movement. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities, communities that are quite vulnerable economically. Now, many of these communities have been sold on prisons as an answer to their economic woes, and very often the benefits that prisons provide these communities are grossly exaggerated. In some communities, prisons have turned out to be a net loss, but nonetheless, communities across America have now come to believe that their economy depends on prisons. They need the jobs. Now, I know there's many people who say this is just dreaming, pie in the sky, there is no hope of ending mass incarceration in America. Just as many people were resigned to Jim Crow in the South and said, yeah, it's a shame, but that's just the way that it is. Do the hard work of movement building. The hard work of movement building. Movement building that I believe must be on behalf of poor people of all colors.